Okay, in terms of the stuff, as usual, just about news. Something good news, but about today. Deadline, same as been all along. June 9th, exam 2, covering part 2 of the previous stuff, and quizzes part 3, covering the metaphysics and epistemology stuff. Deadline applies at the end of the day, 11 to 9 p.m. Exam 3, deadline applies on June 17th, which covers the part 3 stuff. And then on June 18th, exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam number 5, final, deadline applied end of day, June 18th. And then for the paper, if you want to do a draft, just drop off a draft during office hours or class, and I'll mark it up, put a tentative grade on it.
You said, I'm sorry, because I kept thinking it was June 5th. You said, when was the last day of the draft?
Draft would be June 10th, because then the next day, the 11th, is the deadline for the +5 bonus.
Okay.
Yep. And so turn as many drafts as you want until either you get the grades you like, or you get sick of it, or time comes to an end. The deadline to get the +5 bonus is June 11th, end of day, 11 to 9 p.m. Just upload to the Blackboard, you'll get the +5. Full credit deadline is June 15th, and then half credit June 18th. And then I'll put the grades into, the final grades into a Rattler on June 19th, and that way the grades will be in there and ready to go. And so if you have like an issue with the grades or anything, be sure to contact me before then, because when they're not, finalized, then they're easy to change. Just go on Rattler, just change the grade. But once they're in, the iRattler finalized, then it becomes a much more difficult, often impossible matter. Okay, so that's the stuff to be. Before going into the stuff that is, or will be, anything about the stuff that has been, or the stuff that will be, that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we transitioned from our look at epistemology, which is about the stuff that we can know and can't know, looked at our the dead skeptics, looked at our good dead friend Descartes, and looked at 2 attempts, foundationalism and coherentism, to try to solve that problem, which of course all failed, so I guess the skeptic wins. Now we turn to metaphysics, which is about the study of the nature and structure of reality, dealing with questions like, what is real? Is space real? Is time real? Is time travel possible? What is a person? What is a mind? Does God exist? Which we looked at before. All that stuff. And we looked at some of the metaphysical problems we'll be addressing, problem universals, what, in virtue of what is an individual, a member of a class, the nature of mind, what is mind, and the problem of personal identity. What is a person, and what is it to be the same person, distinct from all other persons and things. Now there's a whole bunch of concepts and definitions in metaphysics, and here are some that will prove useful, or perhaps useless, later on. As we saw before, one thing that people who do ontology talk about are ontological kinds. And as we saw, ontology comes from the Greek word ontos, meaning thing, or as I prefer to define it, stuff. So it's a study of things, or study of stuff, or stuffology, as I prefer to think of it. Now, an ontological kind is not like a kind of thing like a cat or a kiwi, fruit of a bird, or a water bottle or whatever. It's a kind in terms of the basic constituents of reality. So, for example, one ontological kind might be a immaterial substance, the ghosty stuff, or material substance, the physical stuff. And when doing metaphysics, kind of the big issue is what sort of things metaphysically are there? What is real? Another concept, property. Not in the sense of like owning stuff, like playing Monopoly and buying up the properties, but in the sense of equality. For example, properties would be things that we think of like size, shape, color, mass, volume, etc. The qualities of things. And when we look at the problem of universals, part of that is the problem of, in virtue of what are things falling into certain categories, And what are the qualities of things? Are they, metaphysical qualities or something else? We saw earlier on the notion of substance, which crudely put is stuff. One way to look at it that some of the ancient thinkers took on was the idea that it's something that can exist on its own, as opposed to something that depends on something else. And the usual crappy example I give is, with a folder. The folder has various properties: size, shape, dimension, and color, and we think we can't encounter those on their own. So you can encounter a folder, but you won't encounter like wrench. You won't encounter like just rectangularity drifting around. You won't encounter just mass, typically just kind of hanging out. And so thinkers, claim that those properties or qualities are connected to a substance. In the end, the crappy analogy I typically use is Mr. Potato Head. Think of like the potato as the substance and the stuff that's stuck into it as the properties. So you can think of like the color being like the nose stuck into Mr. Potato Head, the mass being like the ear stuck into Mr. Potato Head, etc. This would be this mysterious stuff that holds everything together. Now, as we'll see, some people think substance is mysterious and weird and crazy. So not everyone buys substance. Now, when it comes to the types of substances there are basically three main camps for those who believe in substance. We saw these before. One option is dualism. And that's the basic sort of standard idea that you've got a physical world, the body, the machine, the shell, and then you have immaterial stuff, the ghost, the spirit, the mind. And the big challenge for that is trying to figure out how the ghost drives around the machine. So if you believe in two types of stuff, physical bodies, ghosty minds, then you'd be a dualist. Not in the sense of, pistols or swords at dawn, but in the sense of the two types of stuff. Now, some folks believe that there are minds, but no physical stuff. And they would be what's known as idealists. Not... Seems like they were just doing that yesterday, but I guess thorough. I appreciate, I respect thoroughness in the job. So, idealism and materialism. So some folks take the view that there's no material stuff. Everything around us is purely mental. And the most famous example of this is a dead guy named George Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley. And I mentioned before that everyone's heard the question, tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. And Berkeley believed that everything was mental. So to be is to be perceived. So the way things exist is they're perceived by thinkers. Now his answer to that, in case someone asks you that at like a party or something and says, tree falls in the forest doesn't make a sound, you can say, George Berkeley. And the answer is this. For Berkeley, God is watching everything at all times. So when the tree falls, God sees it falls. So he hears the sound. So yeah, there's always someone there, namely God, to hear it. Or so he claimed. And then he died. Not immediately afterwards, but a while afterwards. Now, a very popular view today, this one is pretty unusual, but the second one here, third one here, materialism or physicalism, is a view that everything is physical. We're material boys and girls in a material world, to steal from Madonna's song, or a song she also got from someone else. And so that's a view that's all just physical. No ghosty stuff, no minds, no spirits, just physical stuff. And this is super popular today. Most, I guess, normal people, so to speak, the majority of people, tend to be dualists. They believe we have a ghosty mind, a spirit or a soul, physical body, you die, you go on perhaps to heaven or an afterlife. Most people in the sciences and so forth tend to be materialist, it's all physical, and only philosophers tend to be idealists in that sense. Last couple of concepts. Another thing that people who do the problem universals throw around are the concept particular and universal. Particular exactly what it sounds like. It's an individual. Some particular, you're particular, that's particular. It's an individual thing. You know, being me or being that bottle. In contrast, a universal is something that can be, the idea is that can be multiply located. It can be the same thing in different places at the same time, which seems really weird, which is one of the main criticisms against it. So that's some of the metaphysical concepts, and we'll see more as we go through the stuff. Before pressing away from the concepts, anything about any of that stuff that needs more stuff? Now, one rather good question is, so how does one do metaphysics? You know, what are kind of the rules of the game? Because it seems like kind of a weird sort of thing. Well, interestingly, or boringly enough, it's all like doing any kind of theory, be it economics, chemistry, or physics. And interestingly, or boringly enough, it's also like, you know, buying a car, or a smartphone, or breakfast cereal. And here's how it works. In general, when you're buying a theory, it's kind of like buying a smartphone, you know, with obvious differences. But the idea is basically this. When you're buying a new smartphone, what you do is you look at, like, the cost, and you look at the stuff you get, like what sort of processor does it have? How much memory does it have? What version, what operating system does it use? Is it using iOS? Is it using you know, some version of Android, using Windows, Ubuntu? The company that, well, Canonical makes a version of Linux, came out with their own phone too, so more options. And so you look at all that stuff, price, features, operating system, memory, and you decide which one to buy. And the best way to buy is getting the most stuff for the least cost. And weirdly, perhaps thanks to the influence of economics on everything, theories work kind of the same way. So if you're in physics or chemistry and you're looking between theories, you look at what are all the features and good stuff this theory does, weighed against its cost. Not the cost in like money, because you don't buy theories with money. You can buy research with money, but not, you know, theories themselves. And so the kind of the coinage is different from cash. So what is the coinage for assessing a metaphysical theory? What are the costs and what are the benefits? And again, the basic idea is you weigh them. If you get more good stuff than bad stuff, you know, from a theory, and it's better than all the others in that regard, that's the one you buy. Just like when you're shopping for smartphones. You get your budget, you look at all the features, look at the cost, and you buy, presumably, the best smartphone within your budget. Now here are some of the costly things. One of the big classic ones, and a good thing to know sort of in general, is from our good dead friend, William of Ockham. It's sometimes spelled differently. He's William of Ockham because supposedly he was from Ockham. And names, you know, during that time period kind of shifted around a bit. So you might see it spelled, you might see like a K thrown there, maybe a K and H. But we usually go with this some of the time. Now his famous quote about this is the quote, "Do not multiply entities beyond necessity." What does that mean? Well, the idea is, if you have two theories, and one theory requires more ontological kinds, or more sort of, you know, basic, you know, entities, then that's a mark against it. Or put another way, the idea is that if a theory has less stuff, so to speak, then it's a better theory. And I'll use a non-metaphysical example to illustrate how this principle works, like in the sciences, also metaphysics as well. Now there's an interesting and somewhat terrifying phenomenon known around the world called night terrors, although it can happen during the day, but usually at night. And what happens is this. A person will be asleep, and then they'll wake up suddenly. They'll be fully conscious. But here's the scary part. The person is unable to move. They're completely paralyzed, which is kind of bad just in and of itself. But to make things worse, they can feel, they can sense a terrible presence in the room, something malicious and evil, gazing upon them, clearly intending to do something terrible, something unspeakable. They can't move, they can't even scream. They just have to lie there as a terrible thing approaches to do only God knows what. And that's night terrors. It's, you can't move, you're frozen in place, and you have this terrible feeling that something is there in the room with you. Something awful. Now, as you might imagine, in the past, people would explain this in terms of like demons. A demon has come, paralyzed you with its, magical demon powers, and is going to do something bad. Or in terms of like, witchcraft or sorcery. A witch or a sorcerer has paralyzed you, and they're coming to do something horrible. Then, of course, later in the 50s, when flying saucers came into play, it's an alien coming with their probe, coming to probify you. Now, so that's one explanation, or actually several. Could be demons, could be witches, could be sorcerers, wizards, could be aliens, all that weird stuff. So those are some possible explanations. Now, since it occurs in so many cultures across so many times, scientists wondered, maybe it's not just BS. Maybe there's something to this. And so they investigated it and put, kind of roughly and a bit informally, roughly put what they found is this. Everyone's had dreams where you've been like running and moving around and stuff. You may wonder, when I'm asleep, why don't I get up and like run around and do stuff? Which is a pretty good question. I mean, some people do. There are people who sleepwalk, there are people who sleep run, there are people who sleep eat, and there are even people who sleep murder. There's a famous case where someone, drove to their mother-in-law's, killed her, drove back, and was asleep. And they were actually acquitted because they were on a medication that apparently had that as a side effect. They don't put it on, you may murder people in your sleep on it, although they probably should. But anyways, getting back to the main point, roughly put, what we have, and this is not super accurate, but gets the point across, we have kind of like a safety in our nervous system. Just like with a gun. If you have a gun, you have the safety on, assuming it's working, you can pull the trigger all day and the gun's not going to fire. Which is generally a good thing. You want to have a safety so you don't have accidental shooting. And our nervous system is kind of the same sort of deal. When we go to sleep, it's like the safety gets clicked on. So that way when you're dreaming about running or killing people or doing stuff, you don't run around, and do all that stuff. You just kind of lay there twitching a little bit, which is safer. Now, what can happen, of course, just like with a gun, you may want to be shooting, but the safety may be malfunctioning. So no matter, you can't pull the trigger, even though you want to. And likewise, kind of the safety can malfunction in our nervous system. So you wake up, and your safety should be clicked, off, but it's left on. So you're laying there, you're fully conscious, but you can't move. But then scientists wondered about, why do people feel so scared? And they found that if they stimulate the appropriate part of the brain electronically, they can create the same effect, create that feeling of a terrible presence. And so we have two possible explanations. One involves like demons or witches or aliens. The other is purely physiological. You get a safety feature, so to speak, in the nervous system, it malfunctions, and you have this result. Now, Occam's razor tells us you go with what involves less entities, not multiplying them beyond necessity. So we can believe in demons, witches, or aliens coming to probe, or we can go with something that involves less entities, namely just the nervous system malfunction. And so scientifically, it's a better explanation, because it explains what's going on without all that unnecessary stuff. And so it's commonly used in metaphysics. So if you have a theory that handles something, like the problem universals, the problem personhood, without all kinds of extra entities, then it's a good explanation. In terms of an example from metaphysics, interestingly or boringly enough, and somewhat ironically, people who argue against God use Occam's razor. How so? Well, take the usual argument. If you can explain, all the species, on Earth and presumably the universe in terms of natural selection, as opposed to intelligent design, you don't need God. And so God would be unnecessary. You toss him out of the theory. And so the main argument as to why, say, for atheism from like evolution, Big Bang, etc., is you can have the universe and all this stuff with no God. So you don't need God, so he's out by Occam's razor. So a pretty useful thing. Now, closely related is the notion of simplicity. Everyone's heard the expression, keep it simple. Similar idea in theories. In general, if you have two theories, and they're equally chock full of goodness, if one theory is simpler than another, that's considered to be a better theory, because simpler is taken to be better. And they do this again in economics, chemistry, physics, biology, and also metaphysics. So if you have two theories and one's simpler, the prize goes to the simpler. Now this one will seem kind of odd, perhaps a little weird, but it's this idea. In general, if a theory has more mystery or weirdness, that's a minus against it. Because the idea is that theories are supposed to get rid of mystery and weirdness, and the more mysterious or weird a theory is, the worse. Now in the case of metaphysics, that may seem kind of odd, because it's like, metaphysics is pretty weird, so that's, it's all weird. It's how do you pick between weirdness. But there are degrees of weirdness. For example, take the problem of universals. We saw, Plato's forms. You got these perfect, unchanging, eternal forms, often, Plato space, that somehow interact here outside of space and time. And that's pretty weird. So if you have a theory that doesn't have all that weird Plato, Plato space stuff, that's a plus in its favor. But of course, weirdness, like beauty, is often the eye of the beholder. So what seems like really weird to one person may be less weird and mysterious to another. But in general, weirdness bad, less weirdness better. Now kind of connected to that is the idea of plausibility. One thing when engaged in just sort of general critical thinking, the idea is that you look at how plausible, or initially plausible, or intuitively appealing a theory or explanation might be. And the idea is that the more intuitively appealing, the more plausible something seems, that's a point in its favor. Crudely put, if you say, yeah, that makes sense, as opposed to, nah, that's crazy talk, that's a plus in its favor. Now, plausibility, of course, once again can be in the eye of the beholder, because some people think things are like really plausible, as opposed to what other people might think. I mean, kind of linking it to Occam's razor, one way to explain disease could be magic. There's a view common among human cultures that disease is caused not by viruses or bacteria, but by evil magic, that people can place curses, etc. Now, to people who live in the West and are exposed to the germ theory of disease, the idea of magic caused disease seems pretty implausible. But if a person is in a culture that accepts magic, then that would seem to be the more plausible explanation. So plausibility can be kind of relative. But in general, plausibility a plus. Next thing, the primitive state. Coming back around. Now, in this case, primitiveness doesn't mean the theory is like wearing bear skins and carrying a flint knife. What it means is this. In a theory, a primitive is something that's not analyzed, not explained. It's taken, another way to look at it, it's taken as an assumption that you don't, analyze typically, or, you may not even argue for. You leave it unanalyzed, essentially unexplained. Now, every theory has to do that. Why? Well, going back to the ancient days of yesterday and the day before, we saw that because of the skeptical problem, if you have to explain everything or analyze everything, you go on forever, and you'd never be able to get your theory started. And so every theory, they're kind of a workaround, which may be seen as a cheat, is that every theorist is allowed to take some things as unexplained, as primitives, because you got to begin with something and move on from there, which the skeptics would say is a total cheat, but You kind of got to do it. Now, since the goal of theories is to explain stuff, the more primitives a theory has, the worse the theory is, because you leave more and more unexplained. Now, this is something that happens not just in philosophy, but also in the sciences. You got to have a certain beginning point, a starting point where you don't, explain that. Otherwise, again, you'd be going on forever. You can never get started. Now, as I mentioned, the goal of all these theories is to explain stuff or solve problems. So these are kind of like, in a way, things you want to have. You want to be plausible, avoid primitives, avoid weirdness, keep it simple, avoid, unnecessary entities. But kind of the main thing Okay, the main thing is explanatory power / problem solving. And the idea is this. The more a theory can explain stuff, because that's their kind of function, to explain something or solve a problem. For example, the theory of evolution is designed to, crudely put, explain your organisms. How is it that we have all this apparent complexity? Answer, natural selection, the theory of evolution. Or if you have a theory about mass or gravity, you have theories that are supposed to explain how stuff works. And the same with metaphysics. The theory is supposed to have explanatory power or solve a problem. To give one example, if we take like the problem of personal identity, a theory that is aimed at solving that would try to solve that problem, tell us what a person is. And so the better it solves the problem or explains stuff, that's a plus in its favor. Last few things. There's also a quality called fruitfulness, which doesn't mean that the theory, gives you, bananas or kiwis, the fruit, not the bird. What it means is this. You often hear of, like in technology or government programs, what they call spin-offs. For example, the NASA's, work had various spin-offs, for example, like Tang. Or we had spin-offs from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research, et cetera, giving us the internets and so on. And theories are kind of the same way. You sometimes get spin-offs from theories, just like with, quantum physics. One spin-off was GPS. Interesting there, boring enough. And so when you get a metaphysical theory, it may, in addition to solving the problem it was aimed at, give like other stuff. And that's a plus in its favor. Just like, to use a business analogy, if you have a product that gives you all kinds of spin-offs, to use a crappy analogy, if you have like a movie or a comic book that gives you a movie and gives you all kinds of toys and glasses at McDonald's and so forth, that's a plus. Likewise with the theory, it has all these spin-offs, plus in its favor. Now the last three things are kind of general things. A theory needs to be coherent, because incoherence is bad. It's got to be consistent, because inconsistency is bad. And of course it can't run around in a circle. So those are kind of the ground rules for metaphysics. Essentially you're toting up the negatives, the positives, and if the theory is more good stuff going for it than bad stuff, then that's a better theory. Before heading into our more further adventures in metaphysics, anything about that needs more stuff? Now our first look in metaphysics will be at our good dead friend John Locke. Born in 1632, died in 1704, still dead today. Now, like many thinkers of this time, he was educated in sort of the previous tradition. And like many thinkers of his time, people like Descartes, etc., he was kind of a revolutionary in philosophy, changing the way it was done. Also revolutionary in political thought, etc., changing stuff. Now he was, in addition to his work in philosophy, He served as a physician. He helped draft the Constitution for the Carolinas, in the United States, and did a variety of other stuff. He also had association with the English Civil War, the idea being that, well, the English Civil War is, like most civil wars, English people killing English people over how the monarchy was going to work. You had on one side people supporting a limited Protestant monarchy with the Parliament, and the people on the other side supporting a more traditional absolutist monarchy. And they decided to solve it the old-fashioned way by killing the hell out of each other until somebody gave up. Kind of a human tradition. Now Locke sided on the side of limited monarchy and Parliament. And so when the other side was kind of winning, he did what any sensible Englishman did when there was too much trouble. He went to Holland. And then when things swung back around, he came back. He wrote a lot of stuff. His two super works, the ones that gave him lasting fame, were, in the realm of politics, two treatises on government in 1690. It is pretty important because it lays down and lays out the foundation for, by and large, Western political thought. The kind of the core is, rights to life, liberty, and property. And to make sense of the world today, in the whole system of democracy and rights and so forth, and the justification of political power, Locke's kind of the go-to guy. The political system we live in today is incredibly influenced by Locke. Because we all live in ideas, weirdly enough. We live in worlds that are just made up. And Locke, made up the system, along with everyone else is contributing. And so to understand the make-believe world we live in, it helps to know the people who wrote that particular story. His second great work was an essay concerning human understanding, which is considered, a groundbreaking work in metaphysics and epistemology, which lays out, lots of important stuff. So Locke, super dead, but super important. He also cranked out some other works, such as letters concerning toleration, some thoughts concerning education, and the reasonableness of Christianity. Eventually he retired from active stuff, and then died in 1704, and is of course still dead today. Now, for Locke's metaphysical stuff, we'll take a look at the issue of personal identity, which again is, as we saw before, a pretty important issue. The basic idea is there's two parts to it. One is the definition of what it is to be a person. And that is, not just a metaphysical question, but has implications in law and ethics. And I gave last time two concrete examples. The moral and legal debate about abortion does connect strongly to the idea of personhood. Also, at the other end of life, euthanasia also connects to the ethics of it, connects to personhood. And then, of course, there are the sort of metaphysical, currently concerns, kind of sci-fi concerns, about things like backing up your mind. And the question would be, if they back up your memories, etc., is that really you? So, interesting stuff, or boring stuff. Now, in addressing this, Locke begins with the common assumption of his time. Back in Locke's time, most thinkers bought into substance, stuff. And the argument, Locke lays out the stock argument, that qualities cannot subsist sine res substante, that is, basically, without substance. And the argument is, the same one I gave earlier. You take like a folder, you can encounter folders, water bottles, markers, kiwis, both the fruit and the bird, but you never encounter just like, reddishness, just kind of hanging out on its own. You don't encounter like rectangularity or mass hanging out on its own. And so people wonder, why not? Why do we always find stuff together? And one explanation is that properties can't exist on their own. They just can't be out hanging around on their own. They always got to be like stuck to something. And so they hit on the notion of substance. It's that mysterious stuff that all the qualities kind of stick into. Again, go with my crappy analogy, it's like Mr. Potato Head. You stick all the pieces into it, and it holds them. Now Locke presents kind of a humorous story, but as you probably noticed, philosophy humor is, well, they generally say to tell philosophers, don't quit your day job and try to go on to comedy. Although there are some famous, philosophers who became comics, like Steve Martin, for example, and of course Donald Trump. No, poor Donald. Now, there's a classic story which goes like this. Locke tells a story of a person who was asked about, what holds up the earth, which is a good question. Because once we figure out, okay, we're on the earth, a good question is what's underneath it holding it up. It's still a good question. What keeps the earth like where it is, or in space. The answer, of course, the only possible answer was there's a big elephant holding it up. And then the question arises, so what's the elephant standing on? And obviously the only rational possibility is the elephant is standing on a really big turtle. Then the question is, so what's the turtle standing on? And the only sensible answer is something I know not what. This actually, I remember centuries ago when I was a college student, people would occasionally have a poster with that on it. The earth held up by an elephant standing on a turtle. Black light posters were also pretty big then. People would have them illuminated in their room and replace all the lights with black lights. It was a strange time. Actually, all times are strange. Now, what's Locke's point? Well, his point is this. Substance is just like this. It's whatever is underneath stuff that holds it all up, but we have no idea what it is. It's weird and mysterious. Why do we accept it? Well, for the same reason, the story is accepted. You gotta have some kind of explanation, and you come up with the best thing you can. Now, we're still doing that today. We always run into mysteries about, we find something that we're like, how does that work? And usually we come up with something we know not what. To give two current examples, if you're familiar with physics and the big stuff in physics, one of the problems is that, well, the way the universe works seems to be inconsistent with the amount of visible matter. In other words, the matter that we think is there, the universe shouldn't be working the way it does. And so what scientists came up with is something called dark matter, because we can't see it. But it's supposed to be there, because otherwise things wouldn't work. There's also what they call dark energy, which they need that for some other problems. And they call it dark energy because we don't see it, but we postulate it. It's something we know not what that does something, fills in holes, kind of like a metaphysical spackle that we use to patch up the holes in our theory. And whether it's something we don't know what, which the torus is standing on, or dark matter or dark energy, we're always making stuff up to patch up the holes in our theories. And then we hope eventually to figure out what that is. Instead of saying dark matter or dark energy or something we don't know what, we'll try to figure that out. But there's always going to be something we know not what. Theory spackle, as I like to call it. Now, Locke, being a pretty honest guy, notes that the physical substance is, we claim there's physical stuff, matter, and also mental stuff, the mind, the spirit, the soul. And as Locke notes, we don't really have a clear, distinct idea of either. It's this stuff, thinky stuff, physically stuff. And he says, well, yeah, the physical is really weird, the mental is really weird. So if you believe in the really weird physical, you might as well believe in the really weird mental, because if you don't believe weird stuff, you might as well just go all in. And he sort of reluctantly accepts this illicit substance stuff. He's like, I don't really want to get involved with that, but it's the only game in town. It's probably like some physicists today. They're like, dark matter and dark energy, that seems a little bit, kind of sketchy, but it's all we got. So I'll reluctantly accept that. So Locke reluctantly accepts substance. So he's working on the assumption that you got physical substance, body stuff, and you got ghosty stuff. Now he turns to the thing about personal identity. And being a pretty, careful, sort of guy, he's going to do a smart thing, which is basically you want to start off kind of like easy, so to speak, and then kind of use that to work up to, harder problems. So it begins with not full-on personhood, but the identity of just living critters, plants, animals, etc. Now one answer, kind of a simple answer, but an appealing one, is this. What makes, say, the tree there the same tree it was yesterday? Or you can take like an animal, take like a turtle. Those is like, this turtle that's supposed to have been around for like 200 years. What makes a turtle the same thing as the turtle before? And one sort of easy thing to say is, well, same matter. Identical matter, identical tree. Or identical matter, identical turtle. Now, even in Locke's time, before, theories of, atoms and little cells and atoms and so forth, they were pretty clearly aware that matter, changes constantly. So if you take like a tree, we know from, day to day, even moment to moment, the matter is not identical, because the tree loses leaves, the stuff sort of sloughing off of it, and of course it's growing new stuff. Same with animals. I mean, to take a kind of a concrete example, think of like when you feel like a puppy. Starts off pretty small, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it gets older. And obviously it's not the same exact matter that made a puppy before, because now you've got like small puppy, now you've got big dog. And so it can't be sameness of matter, because if it were, it would never be the same tree, never the same dog from moment to moment. So he takes that and tosses that out. So the change, merely the matter changing, doesn't make it a different tree or a different dog. We use the example of an oak to illustrate that. And also, when you talk about animals, the same thing with plants as animals, he ends up saying sameness of living critter, be it a tree, or a turtle, or a dog, or a kiwi, the plant, the fruit, or the bird. It's essentially defined in terms of a continuing life. One way to look at it with a metaphor is, the life is like a stream, or a box of chocolates, or a whole bunch of chocolates in a stream. But the idea is that the life is like a stream, and the matter is like the water flowing through it. So the matter is constantly changing, but it's the life that unites it. So same life, different matter, same tree. Same life, different matter, same dog. Or so he claims. Now, as you might imagine, this also has some practical implications. In terms of like trees and animals, people wonder, like how long does stuff live? And so one sort of one sort of thing would be, how do you decide like if it's the same tree and how old it is, or the same animal and how old it is? Identifying it that way. Now, of course, while some people are interested with the identity of plants and animals, presumably people who are like botanists and biologists, our big concern, of course, is with who matters the most. Does it say us? Now, Locke begins by talking about the identity of man. Now, you might be thinking, what a sexist. Why isn't he saying identity of persons, using, gender or sex neutral terms? Well, there's actually a good reason why he doesn't use the term identity of person, because Locke contends that being the same man or woman, to avoid being sexist, is different from being the same person. They're different things. So he's looking at the identity of man or woman, or whatever we might have, because he thinks that's a distinct thing. So he's intentionally not using person, not because he's being sexist, but because he takes person and man or woman to be different things. So what is it to be the same man or woman? Well, he says it's similar to the identity of an animal. So being the same man would be like being the same dog or the same tree. So how does that work? Well, it would be basically the same organized living body. So I would be the same man as I was yesterday, would mean that I've got the same life, even though the matter is different. Because since yesterday, I've shed a lot of cells, grown a lot more, hair's grown out a bit, lost some hair, and so I'm not physically identical to who, in terms of the makeup of my body yesterday. But I would say I'm the same man because it's the same life, different matter, flowing through it, so to speak. Now, some might point to say, well, it's the soul that makes the same man or same woman. But he says it's not the soul that makes someone a man or a woman. And to argue for this, he says, imagine if you found out that a hog, a pig, had the soul that was once in a man. I guess we could call this a real male chauvinist pig, in a very literal sense. We wouldn't say, hey, that hog's a man. We'd say, wow, that's pretty weird. That pig's got the soul that was once the soul of a man. Or so Locke claims. So he thinks it's not the soul that makes the man. So if we somehow could know, had like a soul scanner, or an app in our Android or iPhone, so you could scan things and see where the soul came from, we wouldn't say, wow, that pig's a man. We'd say, wow, that's weird. That soul was once in a human body, now hanging out in a pig body. Or so he claims. So he thinks these are different things. Same substance is one thing. Same matter or same soul. Same soul, another thing. And same person, quite another thing. So he's doing another kind of standard approach in philosophy and the sciencey stuff, which is kind of being focused on what we mean by our terms, and then breaking them down, trying to be careful. And terminology is pretty important. So then, for him, what is a man, or woman, or whatever? He says this. First, it's a matter of form. It's an animal of a certain form. Today, since we know about genetics, we would say it's an animal with a certain genetic makeup. Whatever the genome for humans would be, that would be, Locke would probably say, if you learn about genetics, he'd say that's what it is. That, certain appearance, basically bipedal, and certain genetic makeup. Now, if we saw something that lacked reason, but had the shape of a man or a woman, we'd still say that's a man or a woman. Or so he claims. Now the reason why he brings it up is Aristotle famously said that man is the rational animal. And Locke is disagreeing. He's saying if you had something that wasn't reasoning, but looked like us, you would say, well, that's, had the right genetics, etc. We'd say that's a man, or basically would say it's a human being. And he doesn't think that reason is what makes just like he thinks the body doesn't make the man or woman, he doesn't think that it's reason that makes something a man or a woman. And he illustrates it with the following example. No, I'll use an example to illustrate his point. Suppose tomorrow, instead of me showing up, you hear like a scratching at the door. You're like, what's that? And you open the door and you see a cat there wearing a little backpack. And waves to you and says, hi there, I'm Rene Descartes. Replacing Dr. LaBossiere today because he's off doing some stuff. And the cat comes in, hops up on here, grabs the mouse, plays it a little bit because it's a cat after all, and then gets the thing going, hops up on the table, and starts talking about John Locke. You wouldn't say, wow, that cat's a man. You'd say, wow, that's a pretty smart cat, which seems reasonable. We don't think of or if you had like a parrot or, that could reason, not just like repeat noises, but actually, talk and reason. We wouldn't say that they're human beings, we'd say they're really smart cats or parrots. So he thinks that being the same man or human is a matter of a particularly shaped body. It's a matter of biology, as opposed to, metaphysics. So, being the same body, having the same spirit, being the same man, different stuff, or so he he claims. Before pressing on, anything about this stuff that needs more stuff? Now, his main thing is, of course, to go with trying to sort out what it is to be a person. That's kind of his big focus. And Locke lays out what he takes to be the definition of person. And what people, people in metaphysics and law have tried to work out that definition. Now, making legal definitions is easier, because the law is whatever the law says. You just get it down in the book, get people to pass it, that's the law. Which in some ways makes it kind of easy. But it also kind of like cheating. You just say it and get it passed, and that's what it is. And so the philosophy part's a bit tougher, because you just can't get it passed through like a state legislature. You get to like actually argue for it and try to prove it. So Locke lays out the following conditions for being a person. If you got these, you're a person. If you don't got them, not a person. First thing is this. It's got to be a thinking, intelligent being. On one hand, that does make sense. For example, why isn't my water bottle a person? Easy answer, it doesn't think. It's not intelligent. Same with like rocks and sticks and stones. They don't think. They're not intelligent. So generally we think of persons as being thinking, intelligent beings. Now, obviously not everyone buys that, because if we buy Locke's definition, then like the zygote would not be a person, because as far as we know it doesn't think, it's not intelligent. And some people think that that's a person, so they would need a different definition of personhood. Similarly, if you have a body, that's doesn't think or have intelligence anymore, thanks to, say, damage to the brain, Locke would say, well, that wouldn't be a person. But some people, of course, would think that would be a person. Locke would say it's still a human, but perhaps not a person. Second thing is it's got reason and reflection, and it can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. The basic idea is that it is, in a way, self-identity. It recognizes itself as itself. Interestingly, or boringly enough, back in the 70s, a person came up with a test to try to address this question. How do you tell if a creature has kind of like awareness of self, that it's self-aware? Now, we know a lot of stuff is like intelligent. Broadly defined, ants and spiders are intelligent. They function in effective ways in the environment. Spiders are good at hunting stuff. They clearly understand their environment, maneuver in it, etc. But how can we test if something is aware of itself? Well, what the idea was hit on was a pretty simple and clever idea. It's the mirror test. Now with us, if there's a mark on your face and you look in the mirror, you know it's you. You'd go, because it shows self-recognition. That's me in the mirror. I'm aware of myself. Simple test, but provides a lot of information. Now, most animals, like for example, like cats. Everyone's probably this like a bazillion YouTube videos of cats being startled by mirrors, and cats usually don't like recognize themselves in mirrors. They think, "Who's that cat in that mirror?" Or like with birds. Birds generally, most birds, if you ever wonder like why do people put mirrors in bird cages? And one answer people often give is the bird thinks it's another bird. So it's like the bird feels it has company. It doesn't know that that's it. Now some animals can pass the mirror test. It's believed that gray parrots, which are pretty smart, can pass it. Apparently like gorillas, chimpanzees supposedly can pass it. And some other animals, like I think maybe certain dolphins can pass it. I had a golden retriever that could pass it as well, because she would actually sit there and admire herself in the mirror. Because golden retrievers they're supermodels of the dog world, and they totally know that. So whenever she saw a mirror, she would stare at her own magnificence. She also recognized cameras. If the camera came out, she would immediately go into superpose mode. So just kind of what they do. So it's kind of an interesting test. Now, according to Locke, those are the standards. So if you get this, this and this, person. Don't get that, not a person. Now again, it has a certain, you're going back to sort of our methodology, this does have a certain intuitive appeal and plausibility. The way we separate out, people from things, is we usually look at those qualities. Does it think? Is it intelligent? Does it have reason and reflection? Does it have self-awareness? And we'd say, if something does, we'd say person. If it doesn't, we'd say non-person. But then we run into those tough cases. Again, the issue of personhood of zygotes, personhood of people who have complete brain damage, and then we get into some sci-fi cases. How do we tell if an artificial intelligence system is a person? Or, if we go out into space, we run to other, creatures, and it's a big universe, so there's probably other people out there. How would we recognize them as being people? Because if we go to a planet, we don't want to be eating people. Like one of the episodes in Futurama, they're eating these things they think are puppers, but they're actually the young of an alien species. So we don't find out we've been eating people, because that'd be pretty horrifying. Unless they're really delicious, then it'd be horrifying and delicious. So that's kind of his test. So what is the central thing about personal identity? Because another question is not just what does it be a person, but what gives the identity? In other words, there's a saying, wherever, no matter where you go, there you are, but what is that you? Where's going places? How do you identify metaphysically that person? And Locke's answer is this. What makes you you? And what makes you distinct from all of the things? So it handles the two things. One thing is, what makes me me? Second thing is, what makes me different from everything else? And that's what, gives me my identity. Makes me, makes me not you, not everything else. And Locke's answer to both questions is this. Consciousness. It always accompanies thinking, and he says, it makes each person to be what he or she calls self, and distinguishes the person from all other things. Crudely put, you are your consciousness. Put even more crudely put, you are your memories and current awareness. And since it's not identical to anyone else's, that's what makes you you, and not someone else. So I'm me and not you, because we have different consciousness, we have different memories, we have different awareness. So that's why I'm me, and you're you, and we're not the same. So for him, this is the sole basis of personal identity. So kind of the key to Locke here is this. What is you? Consciousness. Wherever your consciousness goes, there you go. So if your consciousness is in New Jersey, you're there. If your consciousness is orbiting Alpha Centauri, that's where you are. So, how far do you go in time? Because another part of this is identity across time. How far back do I go? How far ahead do I go? And the idea is this. As far back as your consciousness extends, that's how far you go. Roughly put, you go back as far as your memory. Earliest memory, that's how far back you as a person go. Now someone might say, well, but you may have, like most people, you probably have pictures, there's probably pictures of you as an infant that you don't remember. You may have no recollection of when you were a day old. And Locke would say, yeah, if you don't remember it, that wasn't the same person as you, but it's the same man or woman, that same life going back. So you could have the same, the same man or woman, but not necessarily the same person. So as far back as your memory goes, you go. Or so it goes. Now we do, of course, run into the problem of we forget stuff. Get a lot of stuff. And he thinks that if we ask questions about it being the same substance, he thinks this is not the same thing as personal identity. So he thinks it's not the same physical substance, but it's also not the same mental substance, not the same soul. Because it's about sameness of person, not sameness of substance. Now, kind of an alternative view is that a person is his or her soul. So wherever the soul goes, you go. Locke, though, separates those. So he ends up to drop out of it, kind of like a gingerbread person. You've got the physical shell, the body, when it's alive. The same life makes that the same man or woman. Then he says, you got the soul, but the soul is not the person. What you get in the soul is somehow the consciousness, the awareness plus the memories. And that is the person. That's me, and in your case, that's you. Or so he claims. So, to really drive it home even more, he harps on it quite a bit. Same consciousness makes you you, regardless of the substance. Now, to argue for this, he brings up the following analogy. Everyone's probably heard the expression, the clothes make the man, or the woman. And Locke, we know that's not true, because if you go and change your clothing, you're still you. And he says, by analogy, you can think of the, suppose you could change bodies, or even change souls. Locke says that, well, wherever your consciousness goes, that's where you go. And so he's saying, by analogy, the body is, to the clothes, like the consciousness is to the soul and body. So changing your clothes doesn't change you. Likewise, changing your soul or body doesn't change who you are. Or so he claims. He could be totally wrong about this. Now he also uses, for some reason, I don't know if he knew someone who lost a finger or not, but he claims that, you imagine like a weird accident. Your finger gets chopped off. Now normally, of course, what we think happens is, horrifyingly, if your finger's chopped off, you'd be staying there, probably in chop class, go, oh my god, my finger's been cut off. Get some ice, get that sewn back on. But imagine, weirdly, instead of you looking down at your finger, you were in the finger, looking up at your body, going, oh my god, my body's been cut off, pack me in ice, get me reattached. Now Locke, he's not an idiot, so he doesn't think that could happen. What he's saying is basically, if that did happen, what we would say is, as weird as possible that would be, we would say that's where we were. So if your finger got chopped off and somehow your consciousness was in your finger, that would be where you are. Again, he's not claiming this actually happens. He doesn't want to think that. It's just to illustrate his point that you are your consciousness. Or so it goes. Now his view gives rise to some interesting or perhaps boring problems. Here's the first question or problem. Name of this. Can you have the same person through a change of substance, specifically through the change of, essentially what he's imagining here is the transfer of consciousness from one to another. So, to kind of draw it out, suppose you've got, two entities. You got Bob and Sally. And suppose the consciousness is transferred from one to another. Or, put in, kind of more informal terms, imagine you'd set up like a sci-fi case, or if you prefer fantasy scenario, you can imagine, it being done by magic as opposed to technology, or magic technology. Imagine you have consciousness transferred from one to another. And Locke was writing long ago, but I'll use like a more contemporary kind of sci-fi illustration. Imagine, if you will, that a company comes along, in say 20 years, and thanks to advances in neuroscience and brain scanning and so forth, what they say they can do is they can copy all your memories, get essentially a perfect or near perfect copy of all your memories and your consciousness. And what they'll do is basically provide literal life insurance. Not in the sense that when you die, they pay someone else some money, but they literally insure your life. So that way, if something happens to your original setup, that they can, have a clone body, presumably with like a soul in it, and they take all your consciousness, all your memories, and put them in that new shell, that new body. So imagine, 20 years from now, you're skiing, in the Alps, and you go off a cliff, and you're like, oh crap, and boom. And then instead of like, waking up in like heaven apparently, you wake up and you're in the life insurance headquarters, as they promise. You wake up on a table, and you're kind of startled because the last thing you remember was, plunging down to your certain death. And you wake up and everything's fine. In fact, your body's now, younger. There's no, scars, or no tattoos either if you happen to have those, because unless you get a special package, they re-tatify you, I guess, or maybe re-scar you to make it look original. And you wake up and you have all the memories. You remember being in this class. You remember like what you did in high school. You have all those memories. And you check. And you're like, wow, I remember all that stuff. And the question would be is, would that entity with all those memories be you? And it's, on one hand, right now, it's a purely, what they say, academic, philosophical question. An entity wakes up, the last memory is, plunging off the mountain. You got a little Bluetooth transmitter in your head, so right before you die, it sends off your last memories. And the question would be, is that you? Because if it is you, you've survived death. Your original body's all busted up, probably buried someplace, but now you get a new one. I mean, to use a crappy analogy, it's like driving a car. You wreck your car, you survive, you get a new car. You survive, your car is busted. In this case, your body, it dies, the original soul is gone, but your consciousness lives on. Now, of course, here's sort of the classic problem for this. Imagine you get that insurance package, so that whenever you get a built-in sensor package that is linked up to a satellite system, so when you flatline, your life systems go off, signal is sent. Within 24 hours, your new body is popped out of the freezer, memories loaded into it, reactivated. Now imagine a slight twist on the scenario. You're skiing, mountain, go off the thing, oh crap, and then flatline, and you wake up, or someone wakes up on the table, back apparently to life. And you go home, to your family, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever they have in 20 years. And you're in the house having dinner, and then you hear the sound of someone opening the door. And in walks you. But you're already home. And you're looking at the door, and there's a figure standing there that looks just like you, except they get some scars because they were in this ski accident. And it turns out that you didn't die. You hit the rocks, etc. It busted you up pretty badly. The transponder was broken, so it sent off the death signal. You are dead. But you survived. You were found by like Sherpas or something. They pull you out of the wreckage, nurse you back to health, and you make your way back home. And there's you looking at you. And the question would be is which one is you? And the sensible answer would be what? You're the original. And there's somebody in the house that's been, hanging out with your wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, and that's not you. That's someone who thinks they're you. Which is a considerable problem, because you get someone walking around who has all your memories, and they think they're you. So what's Locke's solution? Because this would have all kinds of obviously all kinds of problems. His answer is this, which does seem to be a bit of a kind of a cop-out. He says that this does not happen is best explained by God's goodness. Because if consciousness could be, transferred, you could have two thinking substances, you version 1, and you version 2, that would be, by Locke's definition, the same person. You have the same memories, same person. And that would be a problem. Because how many of you are there supposed to be? Yeah, just one. But now seemingly there would be 2. And that's one person too many. So Locke's solution, God makes sure it doesn't happen. Now if Locke's right, weirdly and boringly enough, we kind of have, a test to see if God exists, in a way. Not a great test, but potentially a test. If we can transfer consciousness, then that would suggest that, if we take Locke's assumption that God wouldn't allow it, that would seem to show that, either God is, bad or doesn't exist. Again, not a great argument, because maybe, just because Locke says it, doesn't mean it's correct. Now again, this is a purely theoretical problem now, because as far as we know, we don't have that consciousness duplication. But there are people working very hard right now trying to make that happen. Probably one of the initial applications will be this. Everyone's heard of Alzheimer's. You start losing memories and personality, etc. And what they're working on is trying to have, roughly put, a backup drive for your memories. And so what they might do someday is they put, if someone's suffering from Alzheimer's and they can't treat them, they would put like in a, kind of like a flash drive and computer in the person's brain that would, basically remind them, you are John Smith. You live at, 223 Memory Lane. Your wife is, Dr. Jane Smith. Your children are Sally, picture, Sam, picture. Your dog's name is Rover 2.0, picture. And you'd have all this stuff. So when you forget, you just, activate your memory thing and boop, it'd be your memory. And of course, sort of not really the ultimate, but sort of an extension for that would be person backup. And they're working to make this happen. So in your lifetime, you may have that option. You may be able to go to like an Apple store and get Apple Self. They put a little, you get your iPhone, and they put a little computer in your head, so if Alzheimer's kicks in, you'd be able to basically store those memories and know who you are and where you're going. Until somebody hacks it to mess with you, and that'll be kind of bad. Because people are going to hack that stuff, because people are awful. Okay, before pressing on in our remaining minutes, anything about this, or the future, that needs more stuff? Okay. Now the second question he brings up is this. Can there be two distinct people even though the immaterial substance is the same? That's to say, imagine, well, I should erase that. So we'll change the scenario a little bit. Suppose you got, say, Bob, and what happens is this. Bob's forgets. He loses his memory. So all of Bob's memory is gone. To use a crap analogy, it's like wiping out a hard drive or wiping your phone. You might have done like a factory reset on your phone where it returns it back to the factory original, so all your contacts, calendar, photos, personalizations, etc. are gone. It's, in a way, not a new phone, but all that personal stuff is gone. So we can imagine that all of that consciousness is lost. And then, on Locke's view, given his definition of personhood, once that entity started like forming new memories and had no recollection of the past, it'd be a new person. Let's say Bob 2. Now, what he has in mind specifically here is this. Locke was well aware of the notion of reincarnation and the idea of the pre-existence of the soul. In fact, apparently the mayor of Queensborough during his time claimed to be Socrates reincarnated. And Locke was well aware of notions of, thanks to Plato and other thinkers, the soul pre-existed. So, born, soul, dead, soul goes on to another body. Now, Locke's view is this. He does consider, hypothetically at least, that happening. Person's going along, blah, 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 living their life, die. And then, much like Hume said, the soul gets like, kind of like recycling a hard drive. It gets wiped, and then issued into a new computer, and then new memories start forming. And Locke, given Locke's theory, that wouldn't be the same person. And to illustrate this, he gives the example of Nestor. Nestor was... Flexibility is not my thing. Fortunately, it never has been. So people said, oh, must be side effect of aging. Like, no, I've never had flexibility. So I've always known what it's like to be 110. Because I just, no flex. But anyways, so the Nestor case, Nestor was a fairly, minor hero at the Battle of Troy. And imagine someone builds a soul tracker, an app, for Android, iOS. And what you can do is you can go and, take a soul picture of yourself, and what it'll do is it'll go through all the soul database and tell you whose soul you used to belong to. Kind of like, Carfax. It tells you like the history of the car. You get like a soul fax. It tells you the facts about your soul. Now, suppose you find that your soul was once the soul of Nestor in the Battle of Troy. Or you can pick any other historical figure. Joan of Arc, Patton, Alexander the Great, Princess Diana, anybody. Now, what Locke says is this. If you have the same soul as somebody, Nestor or whoever, Locke says if you don't have any memory of being Nestor, no recollection, but being the Battle of Troy hacking people up and so on, you wouldn't be Nestor. It'd be kind of an interesting thing. Wow, I've got Nestor's soul. Just like you might say, wow, I've got, the same car that was owned by, some like James Dean or some other celebrity. And you'd say, well, it's, kind of cool, but it doesn't make me that person. So how does he argue for this? Well, he uses an analogy of the body. Suppose, let's switch it a bit. Suppose having like a soul fact app, you have like a body fact app, and you scan your body, and then it gives you a list of all the humans or creatures that your body, the same molecules in your body, made up. And it has like, you can set it like for a threshold level, like percentage of match. And suppose you find that, an amazing coincidence, you have 100% molecule match to Nestor. So weirdly, every molecule that makes you up once made up Nestor, or any other historical figure you might want. Now in that case, of course, you wouldn't say, "Wow, I'm Nestor." You'd just say, "Wow, that's really what an amazing coincidence that every single molecule that made up that guy went through all this all these paths and so forth from then to now, and they all end up making up me exactly. How weirdly amazing." But I wouldn't say, "Therefore I'm Nestor." I just say, "Wow, that's kind of weird," or so he claims. Now, if though you had memories of Nestor's actions, suppose like you get like flashbacks, being in the Battle of Troy, hacking people down and so forth, and you find yourself like speaking in an ancient language, and you know all this stuff, then in that case, if you're conscious of those, then you would be Nestor. So Locke in a way kind of leaves it open for past lives. If you remember them, then that would be you. But he claims that if you don't, if you somehow knew it was the same soul, it wouldn't be you. again, that's because for Locke, you are your consciousness. Now, just because Locke had this view doesn't mean he's right. Again, one sort of opposing view is that you are your soul. Even if all your memories are lost, wherever your soul goes, you go. You may have no recollection whatsoever, but if somehow you're able to find out that your soul was once called Nestor, on that view, you would be Nestor too. So why does Locke go with the consciousness thing? Well, one reason might be is that Locke was an empiricist. So whatever you know about what's out there comes through the senses. So how do you know who you are? Well, it has to be empirical. And the way to do that is through, memory, consciousness. So if you remember being Nestor, you're Nestor. If you don't, you're not. Or so we think. Okay, before pressing on to our final slide of the day, anything about Nestor that needs any more stuff? Now, one of Locke's concerns about personal identity, because people often wonder, like, okay, what does this thing do? One concern, at least from the standpoint of religious thinking, particular type, is the matter of resurrection. Now, if you look at the Bible stuff, or any religions, there's kind of different views of what happens after death. So, for example, some interpretations in Christianity involve you die, go to heaven, that's it. But there's also the part about Judgment Day. And what's supposed to happen on Judgment Day is the dead rise and walk. Fortunately, not in like a, George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, or more recently, the Walking Dead type of deal. Not in kind of that creepy zombie thing, but in a non-zombie type of scenario. And what the idea is that the dead rise again in the flesh, but they're alive. So it's not like zombie you roaming around looking for brains. It's, you like wake up, and you're like, wow. And I presume that God's kind of a cool guy, so it'll be like you at your peak as opposed to like you when you died or were really old. And so you'll be back in the flesh, there for Judgment Day. Now, as Locke noted, there's, a moral problem here. Namely, in order for there to be judgment upon, say, me, for all of the terrible things that I've done, or in all the good things I've done, it's got to be me. Not someone that just looks like me, or thinks he's me, but it's got to be the real, genuine me. So if I am to pay for my sins, or get the benefit of my good deeds, it's got to be me. It'd be like, to use a crappy analogy, if they're handing out the awards after like a 5K, and they give the award to someone who just happens to look like me, that would be kind of unfair. Similarly, if the police are looking for like a criminal, and they arrest someone, I'm the person who committed the crime, and they arrest someone who looks like me, that would be unjust. Because it's not someone who just happens to look like me, it's got to be me. So the challenge is, if we're going to have Judgment Day, and resurrection in the flesh, it's got to be the same person. So the person staying there on Judgment Day, paying for my sins, getting the award for my good deeds, it's got to be me. So the way it would work for Locke is this. When a person dies, boom, they're dead, and then I guess some stuff happens. And then on Resurrection Day, the person, of course, gets a new body. Because the original body is presumably long gone, scattered, all molecules scattered all over the place. So boom, new body back, but of course it's going to be me. And so Locke's view, roughly put, is that God puts that consciousness, I don't know if he has it stored someplace, maybe heaven, and then puts it in that body. So different body, but same consciousness. So for Locke, that's me. All the memories of all the good that I've done and all the bad that I've done are in there. So when judgment comes up, be it the fiery pit or the nice heaven, then I go there because of what I have done. Now, Locke will see next time also applies this not just to divine justice, but to justice here. Because, like he gave the example of like a crime or winning an award, the only way it's just is if you get the award you earned, not to someone who looks like you. Or that a person is punished as opposed to a person who just happens to look like the suspect. So next time we'll pick up looking at Locke's example of the prince and the cobbler, as opposed to the prince and the pauper, and then move on to some more Locke stuff. So, see you tomorrow for more Locke.